Good afternoon, Bill. Thank you for being a part of this Hour in the Now series from the St. Louis Press Club. Just glad you could be with me today to have a little conversation. Would you kindly introduce yourself, your company, what you do, please?
Sure. My name is Bill Kaufman. I'm the president of Kaufman Broadcast. We are kind of a multifaceted company founded 38 years ago to support the just beginning satellite business. Most of the satellites at that time were being used just at the entry of cable television and also for satellite video conferencing, where large groups for corporations would show up in a hotel and have a meeting in multiple cities. Of course, over the years, that technology has morphed into other things. So most corporate meetings now are held over the internet, such as we're doing with Zoom. And a lot of that has replaced satellite technology. The satellite end of the business, though, is pretty strong. It has been up until the pandemic, that is, mostly for sports. There was a period of time when news was prevalent. However, that has switched over now to backpack cellular technology. So there's this ever-changing technology that's out there, and we've tried to adapt to it as the years have gone along. In addition to satellite, we have 3 satellite trucks that go out and cover sporting events. We also have a live studio in St. Louis and one in Kansas City, and provide the studio space and interviews for the national networks such as CNN, MSNBC, Fox News Channel.
Yeah, it is always fun to see the satellite trucks during these big events. Every once in a while, you'll see a pan of it during a sporting event or what have you. So well, you already mentioned the pandemic, but talk just like a month before, maybe less than that, before everything stood still suddenly. Can you speak to that?
Sure. We have a pretty big presence in college sports. And so during college basketball season, college football season, the 3 satellite trucks are on the road throughout the Midwest primarily, although we cover a wider area. And when the NCAA stopped coverage back in March, and I'm sure it was the same way for other companies, everything ceased. Our trucks came back to St. Louis, they got parked in the garage, and they sat there for at least a month and a half, somewhere around a month to a month and a half before we went out on our next job. And even that was kind of a one-off. But luckily during that time, we've been able to keep all of our employees on board. The PPP program from the government helped. And we got a lot of work done that we generally would have to put off because of being on the road. So not that is what we would like to have seen for this reasoning, but once the everything shut down, the studio shut down, all of our guests started using Zoom from home, and that's been continuing to be prevalent. The studio business has picked up a little bit, but not quite. It's going to be a while if it ever gets back to the way it was before.
So let's go back to before. What was it like before? Robust, it sounds as if.
Very robust with the satellite trucks as well as the studios. Everything in the news business we'll talk about the news business for a minute. Everything in the news business is always generated by what stories are going on in a particular city or a particular area. If you don't have anything going on in that 24-hour news cycle we have now, everything moves on to the next city. So we've had a pretty robust studio presence, both again in St. Louis and Kansas City, several interviews a week. Back during Ferguson, we were doing several interviews an hour. Again, because that's where the news content was.
I'm sorry, Bill. So who is calling you for you to deploy? How does that work? Somebody everybody's got your number, I guess.
Well, something like that. I used to tell people that we were like the phone company in a particular town, that when you moved to a city and you need in the old days, when you moved to a city, you needed a telephone, you called the Bell system, you called Southwestern Bell, somebody like that. That was the one place you went. Well, in our market and in Kansas City, there really aren't any other entities that are focused on providing studio space for the networks. The local stations tend to protect their studio time, either because they don't want to pay the overtime for a technician. The newscasts, as you know, have expanded pretty much, so it's not just 5, 6, and 10 anymore, and it's kind of a bother for them. For us, it's bread and butter. So we will get a call from the satellite desks of mostly of the networks in the U.S., but that's not to say that it doesn't include the BBC. There are a couple of networks in Australia, and like anything else, you get known in a particular market for offering a service, and that's who calls. So they call us first.
So after all this robust business, then suddenly you said March was about the time, and that is when most institutions certainly started to feel, the shutdown and pivoting to a new way of doing business or not doing business. Talk to me about those powwows you had internally. I mean, how did you discuss this? How did you say you're going to move forward, or what were the plans?
Well, there weren't a whole lot of plans. We kind of responded to the environment in which was there. We knew that at some point things would somewhat normalize, or at least we assumed they would, especially with sports. I'll switch off of news again. News content is all delivered based on both on the content, the stories that are going on, and the guests, as there are some guests that would rather sit in a TV studio than they would be at home, and so that kept a little bit of things going. But on the sports side of things, I don't think there was ever a moment when we figured that sports would stop forever. Even in March, when it turned out that spring training had stopped and baseball was not being canceled for the season, just being postponed. The NBA finals postponed, Major League Soccer postponed. All the major networks, or the major sports franchises, because there's so much money involved in sports, we're going to try to find a solution that would get them back going again. And we've seen that happen now again with soccer, NBA, and now baseball.
What do you think? Today is July 29th, 2020. I should have mentioned that earlier, because I like to frame those with regard to our date. So you're into baseball now. So how is that looking to you? It's
looking good. I spent, we do a lot of work for the St. Louis Cardinals. We manage the broadcast compound. And so we spent a lot of the last 2 weeks adjusting to Major League Baseball's rules that really have never existed before, which include for some of the technicians where they're getting testing, COVID testing, especially if they have interaction with the players. There's only a certain number of people who are allowed in the ballpark at all. And there's a lot of restrictions about where you can go and where you can't go. In addition to that, there's a limited number of people that are traveling with the team. The TV announcers are broadcasting from a studio in St. Louis, watching a monitor, and the same with the radio broadcasters. I was at Busch Stadium last night working with John Rooney and Rick Horton on radio, and it was very eerie to sit in the radio booth, see them not looking out the window. The team's was not here anyway, but they're watching a monitor, and the room is silent except when they're talking. There's no crowd noise. It's in their ears. But where I was, there was no crowd noise, no background. But this is not that unusual. The Olympics, it's pretty typical for the announcers to be in the United States watching the games, whatever they happen to be broadcasting, watching a monitor, and then giving their commentary. But the ballpark is eerily different. Again, every time I go there, I have to have my temperature taken. They ask me the same normal 4 or 5 questions that most people have gotten used to hearing walking into the front door of most corporations and some smaller businesses as well.
How does that make you feel when you have to go through all this?
I think everyone is just trying to do their due diligence, because someone could, and not intentionally, but someone shows up for work, they're not feeling well, they have a temperature, and there's a threshold where if your temperature is above a certain degree, you're told to go home. So it's interesting in that it's a little bit of an inconvenience, but the long-term effects of wearing a mask when you're in public, or many times in private, I think in the long run will help to move this thing along. And again, with the word's not antidote, but at some point, hopefully, we will have the means to be able to not have to follow through on this.
And the means to never forget.
Well, that's very true. That's very true.
So have you operated, bless you, have you operated differently at all as a result of COVID? And, well, I'll get to another question in a minute.
Yes, we have. Some of it by requirement of our customers, our clients, and some of it on our own. When the NFL draft occurred in April, in the latter part of April, we sent a truck down to Dallas, a satellite truck, to cover one of the anchors for the NFL network. And we took it upon ourselves to get gloves and masks and sanitizer and take all of that with us. In fact, what normally would be a job where I would send one person, I sent 2, driving in separate vehicles. So we kind of set into motion at that time our own setup of how we're going to respond to COVID. But then once as the broadcasts and as sports has come back, the ESPNs and Foxes of the world have come out with their own rules on how they want things done. So we kind of have shifted into following what the customers want.
Now, do you belong to, for instance, I guess there's the Satellite Association, anything like that, any professional organization that, suggests certain guidelines and best practices?
Not really, actually. The satellite business is a kind of a small niche business. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of very large companies, and then there's a lot of mom and pop companies. And so there is no organization per se. And it's interesting because I think the mom and pop companies are the ones that are having the biggest challenge during this time. Mm-hmm. My company has always been diverse. So we have the studios, we have the trucks, we do work for the Cardinals, we do consulting, we help to design studios, things like that. So if we're not doing something over here, we're doing something over here. But there is no organization other than the St. Louis Press Club, which I belong to.
Thank you. A long-time organization, since 1956. Yeah. So any wild and crazy requests of you during this time? Maybe not wild and crazy. Maybe that's too wild and crazy, but unusual. Things that you might look back on and say, this is what we did for, I don't know, such and such during the pandemic.
Nothing what I would call wild and crazy. I think most of it has been responding to what we would typically do and how do we adjust to that. And an example of that is there's a quarterly meeting for Centene that we do. And normally they have an auditorium full of employees watching a presentation. Well, no auditorium full of employees. Instead, there was a stage of distanced presenters along with Zoom. and it was presented remotely to investors in New York, for example. That was something that normally would have been done in a hotel room in New York, but it's now shifted over into being something that is done electronically using technology, using Zoom.
That's an interesting story, certainly of a big company also pivoting, needing to pivot in the face of disruption. A pivot seems to be, the big word right now, the action word. And
Now, the one thing I did on a personal level was I had an aunt who passed away last month. She was 103 years old.
Oh.
And of course, because of COVID, it was a very limited amount of family members that were able to come to the funeral. But I took an iPad and we streamed the funeral live from the cemetery. We had about 13 or 14 viewers who were her grandchildren and close family members. In fact, there was a niece who is up in, I think, her 70s, a nephew and a niece who were going to come to the cemetery and just park to be there. Instead, they stayed home and they got to actually listen and participate in the funeral.
What a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that with us. And again, my condolences.
Thank you.
So satellite comes in, with an ability to be of public service, certainly. Have you, during this time of civil unrest, following the George Floyd killing, anything that you have covered in terms of the news where you might have had a special assist during some of the protests?
Again, not in the satellite business. That is again a technological shift where the coverage, especially in the major markets, is all being done with what they call bonded cellular technology. It's using where there are multiple cellular cell phone lines that are put together electronically to have enough bandwidth to do what you and I are doing on an internet connection. Well, they're doing it on a cellular connection. So a reporter or a photographer will carry his transmitter either on his camera or on his back while he's moving around, which is why you see a lot of reporters now that look like they're not tethered to anything and are just walking, street after street after street. And that's taken away from the satellite business.
Yeah. And I'm sure, as most folks in technology, there's always something else they'll be doing because they understand the business is ever evolving.
Yeah. Now, on the studio side of things, we have had, and especially more recently, a little uptick in studio guests that are related to various protests. But again, it's the same scenario. People at this time are still hesitant to go out. And if they can do it from home on a laptop, it's much easier. You don't have to go anywhere. You're conducting the same interview. You need to be a little conscious of making sure your head's in the shot in the right spot, and you have some lighting on you, so don't look like you're sitting in a shadow. Yeah. But that's had its impact on us, and sure. I think it'll still continue.
Viva la bandwidth, yes. So how are you now positioned, now having gone through this several months? What are you looking forward to in terms of your own operations and your community work?
Well, again, I'll do them a little bit out of order. From the studio standpoint, we are at the mercy of the acceptance of it. And it reminds me, as we talk about, as we're saying this, I'm thinking about newspapers, which are cutting back on print editions because people are willing to read the content online on their iPads, on their computers. So print is slowly kind of going away on an everyday basis or a weekly basis in some cases. And in the studio technology, as people are becoming more accustomed to using Zoom and other forms of their laptops and so forth to do interviews like we're doing, that has the potential to take away the studio work, especially as the cost for bandwidth becomes reduced and people are getting higher speed connections. On the satellite end of things, it's really all driven by sports. So right now, the thing that we're watching closely is college sports. The NFL and most of the time Major League Baseball, because they're in fixed locations and have a lot of technology, most of that's done over data and fiber optic networks. But the colleges are still done primarily by satellite. So if college sports in the fall does not pick up, then we'll be back in a world of hurt of waiting for it to try to see if it's going to start delayed or if they're going to not have college football and try to hope that things are better for college basketball. It's just kind of a shell game right now of waiting to see what happens.
I have to say the Zoom technology, the platform, and those like it, it's been wonderful. Probably would not have been able to do this series as quickly as we have wanted to under other circumstances. But I do hear of the Zoom fatigue. I've heard Zoom seasickness. That was a new one I heard just yesterday. And, but, it has saved people's lives, really.
Well, it's interesting, back in, I believe it was at the 1964 World's Fair, where AT&T, or the Bell system at that time, was showing a video phone as being something that was going to happen in the future. And, I quite frankly like getting a chance to see you while I'm doing this interview, because I don't get to see you that often. And it's a lot different than just hearing your voice.
Likewise. Thank you. These have been wonderful kernels of, I've learned a lot, Bill. Thank you. I've learned a lot. I was getting the general flavor for things, but it all does fascinate me, and I certainly wish you well. It sounds as if you're diversified, so that's a good thing. And that diversification certainly allows you to carve out other paths, and we'll hope sports continue. Or is that plural or singular?
I'm not going to answer because I'll probably be wrong.
Anyway, on behalf of the St. Louis Press Club, thank you. This has been delightful, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
I look forward to it anytime.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay.